Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor and head of the U.S. Archives, I should say. He's become something of a target of memes where, like, wherever there's a job opening, like, Marco Rubio is going to have to take it on. But anyway, Marco has said that if Vice President J.D. Vance chooses to run for the presidency, that he will not run, that he will not contest that.
US Vice President J.D. Vance is hosting the Danish and Greenlandic foreign ministers, as well as their US counterpart Marco Rubio, in the White House to talk about Greenland's future. President Trump has said he wants the territory and he will take it the easy way or the hard way. Greenland, of course, is a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark, and the Danish Prime Minister says if the US takes control of the island by force, it would be the end of NATO as we know it. It would also be another blow to US-European relations, which are somewhat frosty at the moment. The potential ramifications of this meeting are therefore huge, and it's fascinating to see how Washington are going to handle it. Sohrab Ahmari is the US editor of UnHerd. He joins me now. Good afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with it's a bit of kind of personal stuff here, that it's fascinating to me. You've got J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Marco Rubio going to this meeting. Is there something of a power play going on here? Because obviously Marco Rubio was a rival to the presidency in Donald Trump, which famously called him Little Marco back in 2016. But ever since the abduction of President Maduro in Venezuela, his stock has been rising. So is there a kind of a sort of power off going on between Mr. Vance and Mr. Rubio?
Yeah, I actually don't really think so. President Trump has said, insofar as designated an heir to the MAGA movement and to his own presidency, he's identified J.D. Vance as that person. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor and head of the U.S. Archives, I should say. He's become something of a target of memes where, like, wherever there's a job opening, like, Marco Rubio is going to have to take it on. But anyway, Marco has said that if Vice President J.D. Vance chooses to run for the presidency, that he will not run, that he will not contest that. So I think some of the tensions between Vance and Rubio are basically overstated because it feeds a kind of comfortable narrative of drama inside an administration. There's no political rivalry because one side has already basically laid down its arms, and that's Rubio. And in terms of worldview, I think Marco is not the Marco that he used to be in 2012, 2013, 14, when he was very much a conventional neoconservative hawk. And Vice President Vance is not the kind of isolationist that a lot of his friends and foes take him to be. So I think here, the most that's going on is basically having maybe good cop, bad cop playing off in front of the Danes and the Greenlanders, but I don't think there's like a deep rift.
Now, so let's go into the meeting itself and what's going to come out of this. The rhetoric from the Trump administration towards Greenland has been ramping up, I think it's fair to say, in recent weeks. And how much of this is bluster when President Trump says we'll take it the easy way or the hard way, which would point to military intervention, or how much is all just a kind of negotiating ploy?
Well, I wouldn't put it off as a bluff, because one thing that President Trump has proved, especially in the second term, is he kind of does what he says. So, he had said Maduro has got to go, and Maduro was exfiltrated out of Venezuela. Like he's been very hyperactive on the foreign stage. So, and I think this commitment that Greenland should be part of the United States, whether through something like the Louisiana Purchase in the 19th century, or by other means, by more kinetic means, is like a real commitment. And I think it's very important for the Danes to appreciate that. Like, it's not a joke.
Now, obviously, this is all going on in a kind of backdrop of concern about European security and the future of NATO. And that remark from the Danish Prime Minister saying it will be the end of NATO as we know it. There's been some skepticism within Trump world about NATO, and President Trump came in and said, we're going to make them pay more. And that has happened when it comes to the UK, for example, as well. Within kind of the White House, are they aware of the risk to NATO here, or do they just not really care that much?
I think in terms of the sort of balance of forces in the Western alliance in recent years, beginning especially since the 2022 Ukraine invasion and under the Biden administration, the sort of power balance has so shifted in the direction of Washington, and a kind of European vassalage that some of that kind of rhetoric from the Danes, it may not be taken too seriously in Washington, because Europe has made itself so dependent on the United States for its defense and has gone along with everything kind of Washington has wanted. So like, in a world of an earlier era of France being a real sort of Gaullist force of, serious talk of European strategic autonomy, or Europe being equidistant between Washington and the East and so on. Maybe that would have, but in the kind of post-2022 context, where really, it's become so naked, and Europe has made itself very energy dependent, has made itself, has tied its security so deeply to the United States. Like the U.S., for example, the Trident program, which is Britain's main sort of strategic mechanism, its strategic arsenal is maintained by the United States, right? That degree of interpenetration between militaries, so a lot of Americans are like, oh, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
To put it bluntly.
Now, while we've got you here, just want to touch on something else that a lot of our listeners, I think, are aware of, which has been the ICE raids, particularly that killing of a woman in Minnesota. And J.D. Vance made waves, I think it's fair to say, when he responded to that. What do you think is the kind of the vice president's approach, someone that you know well and understand his thinking, when he was talking about Renee Nickel-Good, who is the person who was killed in Minnesota?
Yeah, I personally wouldn't have used some of the language that JD used. I'm calling her a deranged leftist or something like that. But what I will say is, from their point of view, in 2024, Americans voted to reverse years of open borders under President Biden that had seen 8 million unvetted migrants come in. That's the person who won the election, was the person who pledged to reverse that. And it came in a context in which it wasn't just that under Biden, the feds had had flung open the gates to illegal migration, but that a lot of blue cities and states, like places like Minneapolis, had pledged not to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. And that was still the case. It's called sanctuary policies, where, for example, the Minneapolis local police department will not help federal government officials in interdicting illegal migrants, including criminal migrants. With that being the background, the mentality in the Trump administration is, we were elected to enforce existing immigration law, and Minneapolis or Portland, Oregon, or these other Democratic controlled areas are not exempt from federal immigration law. So we're going to do it. And if you're going to, for example, you saw scenes of the Somali community surrounding ICE agents who are trying to carry out deportations, removals. And you had that scene. The following day, a lot of governments after that, including, I think maybe governments in Europe, if there was that kind of backlash in a French banlieue where, migrant communities surround the police, there would be a sort of stepping back. What the Trump administration did was the next day they sent many more agents. So the bottom line is, they see it as a matter of a small d democratic mandate. We were elected to enforce the immigration laws, and we're going to do it. And your local police department can't stand up to that. Your angry Somali community can't stand up to that. We were going to overwhelm that.
And I think that's obviously fair in the sense of why people voted for President Trump. They wanted him to be tough on those deportations, immigration, all the rest of it. But there is always, of course, a level of degree you've got to look at here, and the kind of level of force used. And you're right that there's been backlash, and I've seen lots of footage on that on social media. But I saw some polling as well, Sohrab, that showed that support for ICE has plummeted since this killing in Minnesota. That Americans were very much in favour of it because they want to deal with illegal migrants, but not necessarily by any means necessary. Do you see a potential change in public opinion on that, or do you think it's pretty solid?
No, I think, look, whenever you have a woman, shot in the face 3 times, the public's going to recoil. People are emotional, and whether that decision by that officer, Jonathan Ross, I'm certain that it was legal, that he won't face any, this is not even going to reach a jury. This guy, what he did under U.S. Supreme Court precedent, if an officer is put in reasonable fear of death, then he can use lethal force. And the question is whether or not, given the totality of circumstances from his perspective, not from the perspective of people playing Monday morning quarterback watching the footage online, from his perspective, was he put in reasonable fear? And he's going to say, I saw an SUV coming toward me. Everything else doesn't matter. The number of shots he took, afterward he shot from the side, all of that is irrelevant, because once he's authorized to use lethal force, he can use as much force to incapacitate the target, which is why a lot of cops do what's called mag dumping, shooting over and over and over into the face or the chest to incapacitate the target. So legally speaking, he's fine, but legal is not the same as prudent. Legal is not the same as wise. And so, when you see footage like that, Americans are going to recoil. And that's something that they have to deal with. However, here's what I'll say is there is a kind of pendulum this way and that element to this, which is the same thing happened after the George Floyd killing. After the George Floyd killing, the polling was even more dramatic in favor of, punishing police, discipline, so on. But the left, then the kind of street antics left that will block roads and go after local businesses and smash windows and stuff like that. The kind of Antifa crazy left went so far that after several years, you got a second Trump administration. So that's the delicate balance that Democrats have to be careful of, because yes, right now they have the kind of whip hand in terms of public opinion, but it's not a permanent thing. If that sense of street level leftist disorder increases, then I think, the balance, the public opinion is fickle and will shift to the other direction.
Indeed. That was Sohrab Ahmari, US editor of UnHerd.